The church bells rang through the small Texas town of Cedarville, echoing like a promise of love and redemption. Rows of guests filled the wooden pews, smiling, whispering, waiting for the moment every heart in town had been counting down to. White petals lined the aisle. The bride's veil shimmered beneath the stained glass glow. It was supposed to be a day of peace. It became a day of blood. The groom, Ethan Caldwell, stood at the altar, sweat gathering on his brow. His hands trembled, not from the weight of the ring, but from the truth he carried. He looked up at the cross above him, then at the doors of St. Helena Church. He could already hear the faint sound of Clara's heels approaching, the woman he loved, the daughter of the man he feared. One confession stood between them. One bullet would seal their fate. In a few minutes, Cedarville's most trusted man, Sheriff Hank Jennings, would pull the trigger that ended more than one life. You see, in small-town Texas, love isn't just a promise, it's a declaration. And when that promise is stained with guilt, even God's house can't save you. Before we get to the altar, you need to understand who these people were, what tied them together, and what tore them apart. Because this story isn't just about murder. It's about guilt, grief, and the twisted line between confession and justice. Clara Jennings grew up as the pride of Cedarville. Kind, gentle, and beautiful in a way that made people pause mid-sentence. Her mother, Martha, died in a hit-and-run accident when Clara was 16, a wound that never healed in the heart of her father, Hank. He was the kind of man who carried his grief like a badge. 30 years in uniform. 30 years serving a town that believed justice lived inside his holster. Hank wasn't just the law, he was Cedarville. If he said a man was guilty, people didn't question it. They just nodded. Because Hank Jennings didn't miss. He didn't forgive. And he sure didn't forget. So, when a quiet stranger named Ethan Caldwell showed up in town, opening a small mechanic shop off the highway, Hank did what fathers like him always do, he watched. Ethan was polite, humble, hard-working. The kind of man who fixed cars for free if you didn't have the cash. Over time, the town came to trust him. Even Hank lowered his guard, convinced this man truly loved his daughter. But every man carries something he prays no one ever finds. For Ethan, it was a night he'd spent years trying to forget, a night lit by headlights, shattered glass, and a woman's final breath. A night that left him haunted by guilt and convinced that confession might one day set him free. Only, confession doesn't always free you. Sometimes, it buries you deeper. So, when the wedding day came, and the bells began to ring, Ethan made a choice that would destroy 3 lives at once. He would tell the truth. No matter the cost. And in that church, before God, before Clara, before her father, Ethan Caldwell opened his mouth, and the past finally spoke. One secret. One confession. One gunshot that would echo through Texas history. This is the story of love, guilt, and a father's vengeance, the wedding that ended in death. Cedarville, Texas, wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was one of those towns where the biggest gossip came from who skipped Sunday service or who left the porch light on too late. People lived slow there, spoke slow, loved deep, and remembered everything. At the heart of it all stood Sheriff Hank Jennings. A man carved by duty and loss. He'd been wearing the badge for more than 30 years, and it had worn him right back, etched lines in his face, weighed down his voice, and made his silence louder than words. To the people of Cedarville, Hank was justice personified. He solved disputes over fences, broke up bar fights, and walked kids home when storms rolled in. But the one case he couldn't solve was the one that mattered most, his wife's death. Martha Jennings had been his light. The kind of woman who made a house feel alive just by humming while she cooked. On a September night 16 years ago, she left church a little later than usual. Witnesses said she smiled and waved before driving off in her blue Chevy. She never made it home. Her car was found in a ditch on County Road 17, front smashed, lights still on. Whoever hit her didn't stop. No license plate fragments, no tire matches, no witnesses. Just silence and skid marks disappearing into darkness. For Hank, that night never ended. It replayed in his mind every time he closed his eyes. The flashing patrol lights on her car. The dented hood. The faint scent of her perfume on the seatbelt. He stopped wearing his wedding ring after that, but he never took it off his chain. Every morning, he'd hold it for a second before putting on his badge. His daughter, Clara, was 16 then, too young to lose a mother, too old to forget her. She tried to fill the silence by helping her father around the house, but he was never really there. Grief had hollowed him out. He'd sit at the kitchen table long after dinner, staring at nothing, sometimes whispering Martha's name under his breath. Years passed, and Clara grew into the kind of woman her mother would have been proud of. She taught at the local elementary school, volunteered at the church, and always kept a soft smile even when her eyes showed tiredness. To everyone in Cedarville, she was the sheriff's pride and joy, the proof that something good could still bloom from loss. Then Ethan Caldwell showed up. He moved to Cedarville 5 years before the wedding. Drove in with a rusted truck, a box of tools, and a story about wanting a quieter life. He opened a small mechanic shop near the edge of town, right where the highway meets the open fields. At first, folks were cautious, outsiders were rare in Cedarville, but Ethan won them over. He fixed cars fast, worked hard, and never overcharged anyone. He had that quiet confidence people trusted, a steady way of looking you in the eye that made you feel safe. Clara's first encounter with him wasn't out of a movie, it was more like life in its simplest form. Her car had broken down on a cold February morning. She pulled over by the roadside, frustrated, when Ethan stopped to help. He didn't ask questions, just lifted the hood and got to work. Within minutes, the engine coughed back to life. He smiled, handed her a napkin to wipe her hands, and refused payment. She insisted. He laughed and said, "Then bake me something instead." A week later, she brought him pecan pie. That pie started it all. They began seeing each other casually, coffee on Sunday mornings, drives to the river in the evenings. Ethan wasn't flashy. He didn't talk much about his past, just said he'd made mistakes, learned, and moved on. To Clara, that sounded human. She saw humility, not secrecy. When Hank met Ethan, he was polite but distant. He asked the kind of questions only a lawman would. "Where'd you grow up? Family still around? Ever been arrested?" Ethan's answers came quick, practiced even, but nothing seemed off. Hank had his deputy run a background check, clean. No criminal record, no warrants, no history of violence. Just a man trying to start over. That small act of investigation gave Hank a sense of control he didn't know he'd lost. So, he let Ethan into their lives, though he never fully trusted him. He'd watch Ethan with his daughter from the porch sometimes, laughing, holding her hand, talking about the future, and something inside him tightened. Not out of jealousy or fear, but because he knew happiness always comes with a cost. Still, he gave them his blessing when Ethan proposed. It was a quiet evening in late spring. Ethan led Clara behind the farmhouse to the old oak tree where her parents used to sit on Sunday afternoons. He'd strung up fairy lights and set a table with candles. She said yes before he even finished asking. When she ran to tell her father, Hank hugged her longer than usual. He didn't say much, just nodded and said, "If she's happy, that's all that matters." But something about Ethan's smile that night didn't reach his eyes. He started waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling as if listening to something only he could hear. Sometimes, he'd walk outside, stand by his truck, and light a cigarette even though he'd told everyone he'd quit. He never mentioned what kept him awake, but guilt has a smell, it seeps into silence, follows you like a shadow. The week before the wedding, Ethan received a letter. No return address. The envelope was old, creased, handled by someone who'd thought twice before sending it. Inside were 6 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. She deserves to know what you did. His hands trembled as he read it. He burned the letter, but not before the words branded themselves into his memory. That night, he couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. The ghosts of his past were no longer whispers, they were footsteps. Every time he looked at Clara, he saw Martha Jennings' face staring back at him, and guilt twisted in his gut until it made him physically sick. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe he'd been mistaken all along. But when you've lived with guilt long enough, you stop believing in coincidence. You start believing in punishment. By the morning of the wedding, Ethan looked like a man on trial. His groomsmen joked about nerves, but he barely responded. At one point, his best man asked, "You sure you're okay?" Ethan forced a smile and said, "Some things you can't carry forever." Meanwhile, Hank was getting dressed in the farmhouse. He looked at his badge lying on the dresser, hesitated, then pinned it beneath his suit jacket. Habit, he told himself. But deep down, he knew better. Something about that day made his instincts twitch. The same gut feeling that had saved him a dozen times on duty was whispering again, but this time he didn't understand what it meant. Clara, radiant in her mother's wedding veil, couldn't stop smiling. To her, the world had finally balanced again, love had returned to a home that had lived too long in grief. As the bells of St. Helena began to ring, people took their seats. The air buzzed with excitement, the kind that comes from believing in happy endings. But happy endings only belong to people who never dig too deep into the truth. There were signs, though. They'd always been there. Ethan's distant stares. His restless nights. His sudden mood swings whenever the topic of accidents or fate came up. Once, while helping Hank clean his gun, Ethan had flinched when it clicked empty. Hank noticed. Didn't say anything, but that memory would replay later, when it was too late to matter. In the final hours before the ceremony, Ethan sat alone in the church pews, staring at the altar. He whispered to himself, "You owe her the truth. Even if it kills you." He didn't know how literal those words would become. The air that afternoon carried a strange stillness, as if the entire town was holding its breath. St. Helena Church gleamed in the Texas sun, its white columns dusted with petals from the morning breeze. Inside, rows of faces turned expectantly toward the altar, their whispers fading as the organ began to play. Ethan Caldwell stood at the front, hands clenched behind his back. His throat felt tight, the collar of his shirt pressing against his pulse. He hadn't eaten in days. Every heartbeat felt heavier than the last. Across the aisle, he could see the camera flashing, the minister adjusting his notes, the guests leaning in with quiet smiles. And then, the doors opened. Clara entered, radiant, walking arm in arm with her father. Hank Jennings held his daughter steady, his posture firm but his eyes softening at the sight of her. For a moment, even he allowed himself to believe that life had finally given him peace. Ethan tried to smile, but it faltered. He could feel the truth pushing against his chest like a loaded gun. His hands trembled. His stomach churned. The pastor began to speak about love, forgiveness, and truth, 3 words that felt like fire against Ethan's skin. Each line echoed louder in his mind until his body could no longer hold it in. When the pastor said, "If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined," Ethan took a step forward. "I do." The words sliced through the silence. The pastor froze. Murmurs spread through the pews. Clara blinked, confused, clutching her bouquet tighter. Hank's expression hardened instantly, instinct kicking in like a man used to sensing danger. Ethan turned to Clara. His lips trembled. "Before we continue, I need to say something I should have said a long time ago." "Ethan, what's wrong?" she whispered. He swallowed hard. 7 years ago, in Lubbock, there was an accident. A hit and run. A woman died that night. I was the one driving. I was drunk, terrified, and I ran. The whispers grew louder. I've lived with it ever since, he continued. And a year ago, I found out who she was, your mother, Martha Jennings. The bouquet fell from Clara's hands. The petals scattered across the floor like fallen confessions. Hank didn't move. He just stared at Ethan as the words sank in, each one cutting deeper than the last. His jaw tightened, his knuckles turned white. The church went silent again, the kind of silence that swallows air. Ethan stepped closer, tears filling his eyes. I didn't know when I met you, Clara. I swear. But when I found out, I couldn't live with the lie anymore. Hank's hand slid inside his jacket. Please, sir, Ethan pleaded, raising his hands, I wanted to make it right. I came here today ready to face whatever comes. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. The echo bounced off the church walls, followed by screams. Ethan's body jerked backward, collapsing at the altar, blood blooming across his chest. The ring he had been holding rolled down the aisle and stopped near Clara's feet. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then chaos exploded. Guests ducked behind pews, children cried, and the pastor shouted for help. Clara dropped to her knees beside Ethan, pressing her hands over his wound. Stay with me. Ethan, please, she cried, her voice raw. Hank stood frozen, his weapon still in his hand. His face was blank, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. He whispered, he killed my wife. Deputy Mark Alvarez, one of Hank's oldest friends, was in the front row. He rushed forward, grabbing Hank's wrist gently. Sheriff, let me have it. Hank didn't resist. He handed over the gun without a word. Ethan's blood soaked the marble floor as paramedics arrived minutes later, but by then it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. St. Helena Church turned into a crime scene before sunset. The once celebratory atmosphere was replaced with the mechanical hum of police radios and camera flashes. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance, keeping onlookers back. The county sheriff's office was flooded with reporters within hours. Sheriff kills groom at daughter's wedding, the headline spread faster than wildfire. Inside, investigators photographed everything. The gun, a Smith & Wesson revolver, was registered to Hank. The bullet casing matched the one lodged in Ethan's chest. Blood spatter analysis placed Hank about 7 feet from the victim when he fired. A wedding guest's phone footage provided the clearest timeline. The video showed Ethan speaking, Clara's reaction, and Hank's slow movement toward his jacket. There was no struggle. No chaos before the shot. Just deliberate motion. Forensics later confirmed the bullet had entered Ethan's upper chest, pierced his lung, and lodged near the spine. Instant death. The guests were questioned one by one. Their statements painted the same picture. Ethan's confession. Hank's silence. The shot. Clara's statement was the hardest to take. She sat wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and vacant. He wasn't lying, she whispered. He said he wanted to tell the truth. He didn't fight back. He didn't move. My father just pulled the trigger. When asked if she believed her father meant to kill Ethan, she hesitated. I think, in that moment, he wasn't my father. He was the man who lost his wife. At the county station, Hank sat across from 2 state detectives brought in to avoid local bias. He was calm. Too calm. His voice never rose above a whisper. Detective Laura Reese leaned forward. Sheriff, you understand the gravity of what happened today. I do, Hank replied. Why did you bring a firearm to your daughter's wedding? He looked up slowly. I always carry. Habit. Did you intend to use it? No. Not until I heard his confession. Did you think he was lying? No, Hank said softly. That's what made it worse. Detective Reese paused. So, you believe Ethan Caldwell killed your wife? He said he did. But you never confirmed it? Hank's jaw tightened. He confessed in God's house. That's confirmation enough. Reese exchanged a glance with her partner. Sheriff, the law doesn't work that way. Hank exhaled slowly. The law didn't bring my wife back either. They ended the session there. Hank never asked for a lawyer. He signed his statement, folded his hands, and said he was ready to face whatever came next. By the next morning, Cedarville wasn't just a small Texas town anymore, it was the headline of every local paper. Wedding tragedy, sheriff kills groom after shocking confession. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. Some held signs reading, "Justice for Hank," others demanded accountability. Social media split into two camps, those who saw Hank as a grieving husband pushed past his limit, and those who saw him as a murderer hiding behind a badge. A neighbor of the Jennings family told reporters, "Hank's always been a good man. Maybe he just broke. You lose your wife like that, you stop thinking straight." Others weren't as forgiving. He had a choice, one resident said. He chose revenge. The church closed for repairs after the investigation. The blood had been scrubbed from the floor, but locals said the scent of gunpowder lingered long after. Texas Rangers took over the case within 48 hours to avoid conflict of interest. Every record connected to Ethan Caldwell was pulled. That's when the first cracks appeared. Ethan Caldwell didn't exist. His real name was Daniel Cole, a man who had disappeared from Lubbock 8 years earlier after being questioned in connection with a hit-and-run accident that killed a woman named Martha Jennings. The case had gone cold after lack of evidence, but the discovery reignited everything. Detective Reese stood in the evidence room, reading Ethan's, Daniel's, old file. He was questioned but never charged, she said. The witness couldn't ID him, and the DNA sample was too small to confirm. The lab retested the evidence using modern technology. This time, it matched. Ethan's DNA was on record from his mechanic shop license. The match came back 98%. It seemed like closure, at least for everyone except Clara. She refused to believe Ethan had been a monster. He made mistakes, she told investigators, but he wasn't evil. He wanted to make it right. Still, the evidence aligned with his confession. The hit-and-run victim was indeed her mother. The vehicle damage matched. His relocation to Cedarville happened just months after the accident. The town grieved for Hank but whispered about Ethan. Was he a murderer who fell in love with his victim's daughter, or a broken man who tried to atone? When the trial began 6 months later, reporters packed every seat. Hank Jennings entered in handcuffs, head lowered. Clara sat in the front row, caught between loyalty and loss. The prosecution painted Hank as a man who took the law into his own hands. He didn't act out of fear, they argued. He acted out of vengeance. He had time to think, to choose restraint, and he chose death instead. The defense called it a crime of passion. Temporary insanity. He heard his wife's killer confess in front of God and his only daughter. Any man would have broken. The jury watched the wedding footage on a projector. When the gun fired, the room went silent again, just like that day in church. Clara was called to testify. Her voice trembled as she said, "I loved them both. My father couldn't forgive. Ethan couldn't forget. And I'm the one left between them." After 12 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. 15 years. Hank nodded quietly, as if he'd expected it all along. When the case files were archived, the evidence sat neatly labeled, 1 revolver, 1 bullet casing, 1 blood-stained wedding ring. The official report listed Ethan Caldwell, alias Daniel Cole, as both victim and confessed perpetrator. It concluded that Sheriff Hank Jennings had acted with intent following emotional provocation. But the truth, like always, refused to stay buried. A year later, a new DNA sample surfaced from the Lubbock archives. It belonged to a man named Curtis Hale, a truck driver who died in Arizona 2 years prior. His abandoned truck, found after a crash, carried traces of blood that matched Martha Jennings' case file. The realization hit like a second gunshot. Ethan hadn't killed anyone. He'd only believed he had. But by then, it was too late. The people of Cedarville tried to move on, but the story never left them. The church reopened, the pews repaired, yet no one ever sat near the altar again. The bullet mark on the wall had been plastered over, but everyone knew exactly where it had hit. Reporters moved on to other scandals, but Clara never did. For her, time didn't heal, it only silenced. The crime that began with one confession ended with 2 graves. And for Cedarville, Texas, no wedding bells ever sounded quite the same again. When the gunshot faded and the echo died, all that was left in St. Helena Church was shock. Sheriff Hank Jennings, the man who had once kept Cedarville safe, was now the one in handcuffs. Deputy Mark Alvarez read him his rights quietly, his voice breaking halfway through the sentence. The look on his face said everything: disbelief, pity, and a trace of fear. Hank didn't protest. He just nodded, eyes distant, lips pressed together as if he'd already accepted whatever came next. Outside, flashing lights bathed the church steps in red and blue. Reporters from neighboring towns had already started arriving. Cedarville had never seen so many news vans lined up on Main Street. Microphones pointed toward anyone willing to talk. By sunset, the story was on every Texas news station. Sheriff shoots groom during daughter's wedding, claims victim killed his wife years ago. Hank spent his first night not in a cell but in the same interrogation room he'd used for years. A different badge questioned him now, a Texas Ranger named Calvin Reese, a man who'd known Hank professionally for decades. Reese tried to keep it procedural. "You understand, Hank, this is a homicide investigation." "I understand," Hank said. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "You shot an unarmed man in front of 200 witnesses." "I did. Do you want to tell me why?" Hank stared at the table, his reflection distorted in the metal. "Because he confessed. Because he took everything from me." Reese studied him for a moment. "You know that's not how justice works." Hank gave a faint smile. "It used to be." By morning, official charges were filed: second-degree murder with possible aggravating circumstances. The same courthouse Hank had once sworn to uphold now carried his name on a docket. The governor's office ordered an external investigation, fearing local bias. The Texas Rangers and the state prosecutor took over. Hank was transferred to the county jail in Waco to await trial. For the first time in years, Cedarville's sheriff's office operated without him. His badge, gun, and uniform were sealed in evidence bags. His office door was locked. The sign outside reading Sheriff Hank Jennings was quietly removed that same afternoon. Clara didn't attend the arraignment. She couldn't. Her world had collapsed in one afternoon. The man she loved was gone, and the father she trusted was now the killer. Reporters camped outside her house, flashing cameras through her windows until she taped them shut. The initial court appearance was brief. The judge denied bail, citing public pressure and the seriousness of the crime. Hank stood motionless, flanked by 2 deputies who had once worked under him. When the judge asked if he understood the charges, he said, "Yes, Your Honor. I shot him. He said he killed my wife. That's all there is to it." The courtroom murmured. The judge silenced them with a gavel. Outside, protesters shouted from both sides of the street. Some carried signs reading "Justice for Martha," others "Free Sheriff Jennings." The town was split down the middle. District Attorney Meredith Cole was known for being relentless. She'd handled high-profile murder cases before, but none with this much attention. Cameras followed her every move. She told the press, "The badge does not place anyone above the law. A man died in cold blood, and justice will be served." Her strategy was clear: prove intent. In her opening statement, she said, the defendant didn't act in confusion or fear. He acted with decision. He listened, reached for his weapon, aimed, and fired. He chose to become judge, jury, and executioner inside a church filled with witnesses. She presented the video footage frame by frame. At timestamp 4 minutes and 27 seconds, Ethan's confession. 4 minutes and 35 seconds, Hank's hand moving toward his jacket. 4 minutes and 39 seconds, the shot. She called it premeditation born of long-nursed anger. The word revenge came up 12 times in the first hour alone. Forensic experts testified that Hank fired from roughly 7 feet away, giving him time to reconsider. This wasn't reflex, one analyst said. It was a conscious pull. Cole also used Hank's old reputation against him. A man who upholds the law understands it better than anyone. Sheriff Jennings knew what pulling that trigger meant. Hank's lawyer, an older man named Warren Greer, took the opposite path. He didn't argue innocence. He argued humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, he told the jury, this isn't about legality. It's about what happens when a man who's spent his entire life protecting others is forced to confront evil in its purest form, standing at the altar beside his daughter. He claimed Hank suffered from a psychological break, a sudden collapse triggered by years of unresolved trauma. He called it acute emotional dissociation, a state where logic gives way to raw instinct. Imagine standing in front of the person who killed your spouse, Greer said, the mother of your child, the reason you still wear a badge, and he admits it, smirking, inside a church. Would you stay calm? He painted Hank as a man pushed to the edge, betrayed by a world that had already taken too much. To reinforce the claim, the defense brought in Dr. Eleanor Price, a trauma psychologist. She described Hank's mind as a battlefield scarred by grief. The confession wasn't just words, she said. To him, it was reliving the accident. The gunshot wasn't planned, it was reaction born of pain. The courtroom fell silent. Even some jurors looked shaken. Outside, the trial became spectacle. National outlets arrived, broadcasting live commentary. True crime podcasts launched miniseries on the Cedarville wedding. Talk shows debated whether Hank was a grieving hero or a killer hiding behind a uniform. Every night, anchors replayed the same clip, the moment Ethan confessed and Hank reached for his gun. Clara refused interviews, but her silence only deepened public curiosity. Online forums speculated about her mental state. Was she defending her father? Did she still love Ethan? One post went viral claiming she'd known the truth before the wedding, though there was no proof. The small town became a stage for the country's morality play, justice versus vengeance. Midway through the trial, a twist surfaced that nearly shifted the tide. A local reporter uncovered an anonymous letter mailed to the Cedarville Gazette a week before the wedding. The letter contained only one line. He's not who he says he is. It had been tossed aside at the time, mistaken for a prank. But once Ethan's true identity, Daniel Cole, was revealed, it became critical evidence. Prosecutor Cole used it to suggest foreknowledge. If Hank Jennings received any warning about Ethan's identity, she argued, then his decision to carry a gun to the wedding was no accident. The defense countered quickly, claiming the sheriff never saw the letter. No record existed linking it to him. Still, the doubt lingered. When Clara finally took the stand, the room went silent. Her voice was faint, her hands shaking as she adjusted the microphone. She described the moment of the confession, the way Ethan's tone cracked, the way her father's expression emptied. I knew something terrible was about to happen, she said, but I couldn't move. I just kept hearing my mother's name. The prosecutor asked, did your father look angry? Clara paused. Not angry. Broken. Did he threaten Ethan before firing? No. He didn't say anything. Just pulled the trigger. Her voice wavered. I lost both of them that day. When she stepped down, even the judge lowered his head for a moment. The next witness was a ballistics expert. He testified that the gun had no safety malfunction. It had been drawn, cocked, and fired manually, confirming deliberate action. Then came forensic results from Lubbock tying Ethan, Daniel Cole, to the hit and run. The DNA from a broken headlight found at the scene matched him. For a while, it looked like Hank's reaction, though unlawful, had a grim foundation. But a shadow of doubt soon appeared again. A week before closing arguments, new evidence surfaced from the Texas Rangers archive, an unsigned confession letter from another man, Curtis Hale, describing details of the crash only the killer could have known. It had been misplaced in storage for years. The defense wanted it admitted. The prosecution fought hard to keep it out, claiming it lacked authentication. The judge ruled the letter inadmissible, citing chain of custody issues. Greer whispered to Hank, "It could have saved you." Hank just shook his head. "Nothing can save me now." On the final day, the courtroom overflowed. Cameras flashed as both sides delivered their last words. Prosecutor Cole's voice was firm. He wore the badge that represents law and order. But in that church, he became the very thing he swore to fight. He didn't protect justice, he destroyed it. Greer countered softly, almost mournfully, "The law may call it murder. Humanity calls it grief." Hank Jennings didn't wake up that morning planning to kill. He woke up a father, hoping to walk his daughter down the aisle. But the past came back, and it pulled the trigger before he did. When the jury left to deliberate, the town held its breath. Reporters waited outside in the cold rain, their umbrellas forming a wall of black along the courthouse steps. After 12 hours, the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. No outbursts followed. Hank simply nodded once, as if he'd expected it. Sentencing was swift, 15 years in Huntsville Correctional Facility. As the bailiff led him away, he turned to look at Clara for the first time during the entire trial. Their eyes met. She mouthed something he couldn't quite hear. It might have been "I forgive you." It might have been why. He never asked. The trial left Cedarville scarred. Some said justice had been served. Others said justice had died the moment Hank pulled the trigger. A documentary crew later filmed outside St. Helena. The church stood quiet, doors locked, the cross on its roof slightly tilted from age. Locals refused to attend services there again. Too many ghosts, one woman told them. The town council renamed the main square from Jennings Plaza to Cedar Square, an attempt to erase reminders of the tragedy. But memory doesn't bow to signs. True crime shows replayed the footage for years. Lawyers debated the ethics of Hank's sentence. Clergy called it a lesson in mercy. Psychologists called it a case study in trauma. And through it all, Clara Jennings vanished from public life. 2 years into Hank's sentence, the Texas Rangers reopened the Lubbock hit-and-run cold case. The confession letter once dismissed was finally tested using advanced DNA tracing. The result matched Curtis Hale, the real driver. The revelation reached Cedarville quietly, almost cruelly late. Reporters debated whether Hank should be released, but the governor's office said the conviction stood, the killing had still been unlawful. When Hank's lawyer told him the news during a prison visit, Hank stared out the window, sunlight breaking across the concrete floor. "He didn't do it," Greer said softly. "I know," Hank replied. "He believed he did. That's punishment enough." Greer asked, "Do you want to appeal?" Hank shook his head. "No. I'm done fighting ghosts." Cedarville faded from the headlines soon after, but the story never stopped living in whispers. In every small town, there's a story people tell when they want to talk about guilt without saying the word. In Texas, that story is Hank Jennings. A man who couldn't let go of the past. A man who thought justice was still something you could hold in your hand. A man who proved that truth doesn't always save, it sometimes destroys everything left standing. The courtroom emptied, but the sentence stayed behind like a weight on the benches. 15 years. Hank heard the number without flinching. He nodded to the judge, shook his lawyer's hand once, and let the bailiff guide him through the same doors he used to walk through as the man in charge. The old lawman left as inmate number 62 to 117. Back in Cedarville, people spoke in quieter voices for a while. The grocery clerk stopped asking about folks' weekends. The barber kept the radio low. Sundays at St. Helena felt different. The pews were polished, the floor refinished, the choir back in place, but a silence seemed to sit in the rafters, waiting to be noticed. Weddings moved to other churches. Pastors adjusted their homilies to include lessons about anger, guilt, and mercy. Everyone claimed to understand, yet no one really did. Clara stayed out of sight. She sold the farmhouse and rented a small apartment in Austin where her phone could rest without buzzing every 5 minutes. She boxed her mother's veil and tucked it on the top shelf of a closet she rarely opened. People sent casseroles that went cold on her doorstep. She answered almost no one. When reporters tried to reach her by email with subject lines that read, "Your side of the story," she closed her laptop and walked to the river. Some days she sat there until sunset, watching the light weaken and steady itself again. Hank's transfer bus rolled through 2 checkpoints before the gates swallowed him. His new world was concrete, steel, and schedules. Morning started at 5. Breakfast at 5:30. Yard time at 9 unless it rained. Work detail if your name was called. He kept his head down, spoke little, and never asked for special treatment. Word spread quickly about who he used to be. A few inmates tested him, curious to see if the sheriff still had fight left. He didn't bite. He lifted his tray, finished his meal, and returned it clean. The guards watched and decided he would not be a problem. The first letter he wrote to Clara was 3 lines long. "I will not ask you to forgive me. I do not forgive myself. You owe me nothing." He folded the paper neatly and stared at the envelope as if it might refuse to carry his words. He sent 1 letter each week after that. He wrote about the sound of rain on the block roof. About the quiet in the chapel on Wednesdays. About the memory of Martha's laugh that sometimes arrived without warning and left just as fast. Clara read some of them and left others sealed. She never threw a single one away. Reporters moved on to newer stories, but a few kept circling back every anniversary of the shooting. They talked to old classmates who remembered Clara as the girl who brought cupcakes to school events. They spoke to parishioners who swore they still heard something sharp in the church air on quiet afternoons. A streaming documentary gave the tragedy a glossy treatment. Slow motion. Violins. Interviews cut to black at dramatic beats. The show trended for a week. Cedarville cringed and then went back to mowing lawns and paying light bills. In prison, Hank learned the rhythm of lines. Meal lines. Medication lines. Laundry lines. He kept to himself in the yard, walking the perimeter in tidy rectangles, for laps exactly, every day the gates allowed it. A chaplain named Doyle invited him to a midweek reading group. Hank nodded and showed up. He didn't speak for 2 weeks. On the 3rd week he read a single verse out loud, closed the booklet, and asked if he could borrow a pen. Doyle handed him one and said, "Keep it." A small thing. It meant more than it looked. The past, however, refused to stay filed away. A ranger's inbox held a thread with an old attachment no one had bothered to test with newer tools. The unsigned confession that surfaced during trial, the one the judge refused to admit, found its way back into a lab. Better swabs. Cleaner thresholds. A partial match became a full profile. Curtis Hale. Long-haul driver. Deceased. His abandoned truck in Arizona carried the same paint trace and glass microfractures found on Martha Jennings' file. The patchwork became a picture. The hit and run in Lubbock belonged to a man already in the ground. The call to Greer, Hank's attorney, happened on a Tuesday morning. Greer took off his glasses and cleaned them twice before speaking. We have a confirmed match, he said. Curtis Hale killed Martha. I'm filing for post-conviction relief. At minimum, we can correct the record. Hank listened quietly. The record needs truth, he said, but the truth doesn't change what I did. Greer pressed. You acted on a confession you believed. That matters. Hank shook his head. I acted on a bullet. The motion drew cameras again. Some argued Hank should walk free. Others reminded everyone that the law isn't a scoreboard. Intent and action are different lanes. A panel of judges reviewed the new evidence, signed an order clearing Ethan's name in the Lubbock case, and amended the narrative in the state database. The word suspect next to Ethan Caldwell became exculpated by subsequent DNA. The ink changed. The graves did not. Clara received the news in a short, clinical email forwarded by Greer. She printed it and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold by her elbow. She read the lines 3 times. Her hands stayed steady. She walked to her closet, pulled down the box with her mother's veil, and placed the printed page on top. She did not cry. She had used those tears long ago. What lingered was thinner and stranger. Not relief. Not anger. Just the quiet ache that comes when a story ends and you still feel like a character stuck on the stage. People in town argued about what the new finding meant. Some said Hank should never have seen a day in prison. Others countered that a man died who did not raise a weapon. The pastor at St. Helena preached a short homily the following Sunday. Truth and mercy are not opponents, he said. They walk together, even when we cannot see their footprints. A few nodded. Others stared at their hands. After service, 2 men argued in the parking lot about whether justice had been done. They both went home feeling unheard. Hank's body began to show its own verdict. A cough that wouldn't leave turned into scans and numbers no one wanted. The prison doctor explained treatment options in measured phrases. Hank agreed to what they recommended but told the chaplain he did not intend to chase time. Letters to Clara grew shorter. I hope you eat well, one said. I hope you see sun, said another. Near the end he wrote, I thought the badge would keep me straight. It turns out truth is heavier. I am sorry. For all of it. When Clara came to see him near the end, the room smelled like sanitizer and old blankets. Hank's hands were thinner. His eyes had the clear look of a man with nothing left to hide. They talked softly for an hour about small things. The river in Austin. The retired teacher who still baked pies for the church. The oak tree behind the farmhouse that another family now tended. She finally asked what she had always feared to say out loud. Do you regret it? He closed his eyes for a moment. Every day, he said. Every hour. But regret does not refund time. She nodded and took his hand. He slept within minutes, the lines in his face smoothing as if sleep had ironed them. He did not wake again. The prison chaplain called her at dawn. She drove without turning on the radio and took the back roads into Cedarville. The funeral was small. A few deputies came in plain clothes and stood near the back. The town did not know how to mourn a man who was both their protector and their prisoner. Clara chose a simple marker. She placed it beside her mother's. 2 stones. One life interrupted by accident. One by anger. Grass will not hurry for anyone, but it always grows. Months later, a podcast producer asked Clara for an interview to talk about the exoneration that came too late. She refused the microphone but agreed to a single sentence for the record. My father broke the law, she said. He also broke under grief. Those 2 truths live in the same house. The producer wanted more. She hung up gently and returned to her textbooks. She had enrolled in a counseling program, focusing on trauma and loss. The first night of class, the professor asked everyone to share why they were there. She said, because people think pain ends when the headline fades. I know it doesn't. St. Helena reopened again for full services the following spring. A young couple asked to be married there, brave or stubborn or both. The pastor agreed. He suggested a simple ceremony at noon with the bells kept to a softer peal. Townsfolk came, held their breath during the vows, and released it when the couple kissed. Afterward, the bride placed a small white lily near the altar without saying why. A few guests understood. Most did not. The church felt a shade lighter when the doors closed. Hank's letters lived in a shoebox in Clara's closet. On quiet nights she read one at random and let the word settle. Some talked about nothing at all. Some carried the weight of a man learning to speak plainly after a lifetime of orders and arrests. In one he wrote, "I used to think justice was a straight road. It is more like two lanes with a thin line between them. Cross too fast and you don't notice. Cross too slow and everyone sees." She folded that one with care and put it on top. What remained of Ethan's name also shifted. The state cleared him in the hit and run. His shop, long sold, still bore a faint outline where his sign once hung. A new owner, a woman with grease on her hands and a calm voice, kept an old wrench above the register that Ethan had once fixed for free. She didn't tell customers where it came from. It was a reminder to be kind because you never know what a stranger carries. Cedarville's library hosted a small panel one evening on truth and consequences. A ranger spoke. A public defender spoke. The preacher read a short passage. Clara sat in the back and listened. After the event, a teenager approached her and asked, awkwardly, "How do you forgive someone who took everything?" She thought for a long moment. "You don't do it all at once," she said. "You forgive an hour. You forgive a day. Some days you cannot forgive anything. You try again tomorrow." The teenager nodded and wrote that down as if it were a formula. Time moved. A new sheriff took the oath. A new choir director chose different hymns. The town fair returned to Main Street with barbecue smoke curling into the evening. Folks told the story less often. Not to bury it, but because grief had finally loosened its grip. The story learned to live beside other stories. That is how towns heal. For those who ask what this tragedy teaches, the answer is not a slogan. Guilt can persuade a person to confess to a crime he did not commit. Grief can persuade a father to fire a gun in a place meant for vows. Law can punish action without curing pain. Truth can arrive late and still matter. Love can survive, but it often changes shape. None of these are excuses. They are the map of what happened. If you were sitting with Clara on her porch at dusk, she might say it this way: "I loved a man who thought he killed my mother. I loved a father who could not carry one more ounce of sorrow. I lost them both. I am still here." That is the lesson the living receive. Stay. Keep going. Help someone else stand. Now, your turn to weigh in. Would you have pursued an appeal to shorten Hank's sentence after the exoneration, or would you have accepted the time as part of the cost of what he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If stories like this hold your attention and teach you something about choices, tap like so more people see it. Share it with someone who thinks justice is simple. Subscribe for the next case where truth tests the limits of love and law.